Good evening, and welcome to Behind the Books, a Caltech presentation that has been going on since we started with the pandemic. It was a way to do a 180 and serve our audiences when we couldn't do performances live, and now we're starting to go back with Behind the Books being a live presentation. I'm Michael Alexander, and my title here on campus is Arts and Culture Liaison, and so I get to work with a number of other very interesting professors and colleagues here on campus, and we have two series. We have the Behind the Book series, and we have the Movies That Matter series, and I'll touch on those both shortly. And then we've got a big project that we're working on as part of the Getty Foundation's Pacific Standard Time that they'll be producing all over the Southern California region this October, November, and December. And we're going to be working with the archives here on campus that have a big exhibit. JPL's got some programs that they're doing, and our program has got 4 different performing arts groups, including one from Taiwan performing a dance with a live robot, not a live robot, a live dancer and a robot. There'll be another LA area dance company presenting works on the life of Alan Turing. A theater company will be right here in this hall doing a play called Tesla. It's a radio play meant for the stage. And the final event we'll have is a choral group called Tonality that'll be devoting its program to music about climate change. Before we go any farther, I just want to remind everybody to turn off your cell phones and take notice of where the exits are. There's also exits on the side. Our crew or cast will be out here to guide you if there's any reason that you have to come down instead of going up, but there probably shouldn't be any reasons for that in any event. I want to thank all of you for coming, and I also want to thank our sponsors. We get support from the Caltech Employees Federal Credit Union. We get support also from the Friends of Beckman Auditorium, and they've been very, very supportive of our efforts over the years. And we encourage all of you to sign up to get on our mailing list. Friends of Beckman are going to get first notice about those Getty-supported events that are going to happen here on campus, so I hope that some of you will at least sign up to be on our mailing list. Some of you might even consider becoming the Friends of Beckman. The Movies That Matter program that we do is going to be bringing to the campus as part of Earth Week a film called Chasing Ice, and that'll be on April 25th. And in May, we're going to be presenting a film called LA Real, which is taking a look at Los Angeles through the eyes of one woman who morphs from being an indigenous resident of Los Angeles in the pre-Columbian days through the various ownerships of Southern California by Spain and then Mexico. It was a part of an independent Republic of California and then the United States. And it's a play that was recorded as a film project. And we'll be doing one of the first presentations of that film. In April, we also will have Behind the Book with Dr. David Zierler, who's going to be interviewed by Paul Wenberg here on campus, and the topic is going to be David's book, The Invention of Ecocide, which looks at the effects of Agent Orange and other chemicals that were initially used in war but have had other kinds of impacts, including some were being used as weed killers just out in farm area. Tonight, we're going to have a Q&A where you can all see a QR code. It'll be put up shortly, and you can look at that with your cell phone. It'll probably, if you use the camera feature, it'll connect you to Slido, and you'll be able to input your questions there, and then during the Q&A afterwards, I'll be up here on stage to pose questions to our two guests. Also, there will be books for sale at the end. Chevalier Books is here, and they will have books for sale outside of the auditorium at the end, and Zev will be there to sign them as well. For nearly half a century, Zev Yaroslavsky has played a central role in the growth of Los Angeles. At a very young age, he became a city council member and was reelected by his constituents to serve almost 20 years, giving up his seat when it became possible to run for a county board of supervisor seat, and continued to serve the citizens, getting reelected until term limits forced him to have to retire from that. And he's continuing to serve us as a professor at UCLA and being very involved in community affairs. my field in the arts always knew of him as one of the go-to elected officials that we could count on to be supportive of public funding for the arts, and in other ways dealing with policies that were good for arts, nonprofit arts that were serving the LA area. Professor Mike Alvarez is the co-founder of Caltech Center for Science, Society, and Public Policy. He's hosted a number of our conversations and is very involved in political science is his area and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. And he's just been very, very helpful with us in getting this particular program together. And so it is with great pleasure that I invite you to all help me welcome to the stage Zev Yaroslavsky and Mike Alvarez.
Well, great. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I am very excited to be here this evening with Zev and, of course, the book. So if you haven't gotten your own copy or haven't had an opportunity to read it, I really do encourage you to give it a read. It's a wonderful book. I assigned it to my undergraduate politics and policy class, and we read it this week and discussed it. So it was a lot of fun and really enjoyed the book. Now, the first question that I've got is, so the title of the book is Zev's Los Angeles, a political memoir. So why did you decide to write a political memoir?
Well, yeah, I couldn't just say Zev's Los Angeles. I had to have something else. It is a political memoir. It's not just a political memoir. It's divided into three sections. One is my pre-political life. I have a chapter about my grandfather, which is a maternal grandfather, which is an incredible story, and then my upbringing and my high school days, my college days. So, and spoiler alert, most of the people who've read the book and who have told me that they've read the book said that the part they liked the best was the part about my pre-political life, because that's the thing that most of you who have, if you have followed my career, it's the one thing you don't know about, and it's kind of interesting how the trajectory was. I found that in most of the memoirs I've read, it's the stuff that I didn't know about from the newspapers. I mean, I'm not comparing myself to Bill Clinton's memoir, but the best part of his memoir is the part that isn't about his presidency, because I know he wrote that part, and the rest of it was written by his handlers. So but the rest of the book, the other 2/3 is a political memoir, but it's not a vanity project, and I hope you'll agree with me after you read it. I'm a trained historian. I'm trained to do two things: to be a historian and to run track in high school. I still jog, and I'm still a historian, and I believe in accuracy and in context. I didn't tell you all of my warts, but I told you some of my warts in the book, some of my mistakes, and I think it's important that people own up to their mistakes or well-meaning mistakes. I have an old saying that there's a Mark Twain saying that goes, good judgment is the product of experience, and experience is often the product of bad judgment. So you make a good faith mistake once, just don't make the same mistake twice. And I learned from my mistakes, and I think that's a lesson there. The last thing I'll say so it's a history, it's a memoir for sure, and I take you into the room where a lot of things happen, but I also put it in the context of what else is going on, which I think is very important to understand why certain decisions which may sound or look crazy today, 30 years ago did not look crazy at all, and we can get into that if there are questions about that. The last thing I wanted to say about the book is why I wrote it. I do have a graduate degree in history. The only thing I read is history books. Not that I don't like fiction, but there's only so much time in the day, and the real thing is better than the made-up thing sometimes. And I believe that people in every walk of life, whether it's in politics or business or a school teacher or a cop, it does. If you've got a story to tell, tell it. And you owe it to, especially if you were consequential in your community or in your country, you have an obligation to share your experience with the rest of us. I was telling Mike over dinner that I tried to convince Vince Scully to write a memoir for the longest time, and he just wouldn't do it for a variety of reasons. He just didn't want to do it. And his last, the primary reason, he says it's egotistical to write a memoir. And I said, no, I said it's egotistical to go to your grave and not share your stories with the rest of us. It didn't move him. And there were a number of people in public life. Roz Wyman, some of you are old enough to remember Roz Wyman. She was the youngest councilwoman ever elected at the age of 22. In 1953, she was very consequential in bringing the Dodgers here from Brooklyn. Controversial in her day. And she served in the seat that I served in. She served for 12 years, I served for 20 years. I tried to get her to write a memoir. She has a story to tell. By the time I got to her, she didn't remember a lot of things, and it didn't work out. So I believe in sharing the stories while I still could. And I told you that I got an email, I won't mention from whom, but from a prominent journalist in town at the LA Times. I assume he's still working for them.
There aren't too many of them left.
Not many left. And he said, he congratulated me on the book. This was just a couple of weeks ago, and he says it's too bad that there isn't a lot written about this period of LA history, and there isn't. I mean, there's some cultural books, there's all kinds of books, but there's no political, certainly no political memoir. There are very few political memoirs that have been written by local elected officials. There's one written by John Anson Ford, who was a county supervisor from 1934 to 58. There's one written by me. There's one written by Dick Riordan, which, as Jim Newton said, his book proves the proposition that you can be a good mayor and a bad writer. That was his comment, and I don't disagree with it. But that's about it. One of my colleagues, Richard Alatorre, who's on the city council, served in the state legislature for many years, wrote a book that got very little attention. I actually think that a big part of that book is really important historically. And I can't think of anything else. There are very few biographies. You realize there's no biography written about Tom Bradley, who was mayor for 20 years. There's one biography written about Fletcher Bowron, who was mayor for 15 or so years. That's it. And there's one written about Sam Yorty, which, so I believe in sharing in not just sharing my story in my memoir, but also to share my perspective of the history of the same period. So it's a memoir nested in LA's history during these last 50 years. That's a long answer to a question.
Well, no, it's a perfect answer because it's a sweeping political memoir. The period of time that your career covered has really been obviously a fundamental time for growth and development and change in Southern California, not just Los Angeles City, but throughout Southern California. One of the things that really struck me in the various episodes that you talk about throughout your career is how many of them involved what I would just call crises. Northridge, the Northridge earthquake, Prop 13, right, which was really a crisis and a revolution. The LA County's financial crisis, which I frankly didn't know much about until I actually read about it. So when we talk about public policy, we teach public policy, we think of it as some sort of rational, deliberative process where policymakers are sitting and they're coming up with deliberate solutions to problems. It really struck me a lot of what you're doing is just responding to crises.
Yeah.
Is that really the way it is? And how do you respond to these crises when you're in office?
So I'll tell you two very quick vignettes, or two quotes. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain in the late 50s, early 60s, was asked by a young reporter, "What determines your agenda for the day?" And he said, "Events, my dear boy, events." And the second vignette is, or it's a vignette, not a quote. I had to kill an hour once. I had to go to the dentist in Westwood, and my lunch was over early, and so I went over to the UCLA football practice field. It was a football season, and they were getting ready for the Cal game, and Bob Toledo was the coach. In the middle of the practice, all of a sudden, he blows the whistle 3 times, very loudly, and everybody's yelling, "Sudden change, sudden change." And it was to mimic a turnover, a change of possession. The defense has to get off the field, the offense has to get on the field. It's chaos. And I sat there and I watched that with a smile on my face, and I said, sudden change. I said, I get that several times a day. A reporter calls, my press person comes in, says somebody, so-and-so is making an accusation that you did such and such. Is it true? No. And so, or I'll tell you, it's a story that's not in the book. I was playing golf one Friday afternoon with a friend of mine, and my cell phone rang. And it was at the Wilshire Country Club. I can say that. I mean, I'm not a member, but he was. And I was on the 18th hole, which is a par 4. Those of you who follow golf, it's a par 4. It's about 410 yards, 420 yards. I've never gotten to the green on that hole in 2 shots, ever. On this day, I just nailed the tee shot and got to the crest of the hill, and it rolled down another 30, 40 yards. And my second shot rolls right past the pin and stops 15 feet from the hole. So I've got a 15-foot putt for an eagle on this shot, on this hole. And my cell phone rings. It's my secretary. It's about 4 in the afternoon on a Friday. And she says, the sheriff just called. There's been a terrible accident, Metrolink accident in Chatsworth. And he wants to know whether he can send a helicopter to you. You probably want to get out there, and do you want him to send a helicopter? And while I'm on the phone, the guy at the next hole said, and I can't repeat in mixed company exactly how he said it. He says, "Put the blankety blank phone down. The rules of the club are no use of cell phones on the golf course." And he was yelling. And I yelled back, I said, "It's an emergency." He said, "Well, if it's a blankety blank emergency, go into the clubhouse." So I said, "Liz, I'll call you back." Now, 15-foot putt for a birdie, and Chatsworth will wait another 15 seconds. And I start to hit the putt, and just as I'm taking my putter back, the guy yells at me, "If it's such a damn emergency, why are you putting out?" Now, I tell you that story because he, checkmate. By the way, then came the Great Recession, and he left the club because he couldn't afford to pay the dues. And the caddy at the club told me that guy is no longer a member of the club, and I said, "Yes, there is a God." But that is sudden change. Now, the minute I 3-putted, it just still sticks in my craw. It's 13 years ago, and I'm still remembering it like it was yesterday. I went down to the nearest helipad. They picked me up and they took me to the Chatsworth site. That was one of the most gripping nights I've ever spent. So I won't go into the details of that, but it was just tragedy. It was 28 people were killed. One of them was a police officer who was on her way home from Van Nuys to wherever she lived out in Fillmore or something. It was a terrible, terrible thing. And the LA Times got a picture of the woman who was the public information officer for Metrolink, who was at the press conference, one of the many press conferences announcing, whatever the most up-to-date detail was. And they got this picture of her grief-stricken, and I was standing next to her, and I remember it well that she, we look at these PIOs, public information officers, and they just tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. And she started to talk about the casualties, the deaths, and the fatalities, and the injuries. She got all emotional about it, as we all were, and she broke down. And for that, Metrolink fired her. And I was livid when I heard about that. The Times it should have been a Pulitzer Prize winner. The grief on her face was palpable, even on a newsprint. And I still have nightmares about that night, for a variety of reasons. A woman who came up to me at the meetup place before she knew whether her husband was dead or alive, and I knew he was dead because I knew where he was sitting. Just a serendipitous thing that I was told, and I knew that I wasn't going to be the one to tell her, and nor was it my responsibility. But I I was just broken. My heart was broken for her. That's one. That's one kind of real sudden change. I mean, that turned my life upside down for a long time. You mentioned some of the others, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but the financial crisis that the county faced in 1994, 95. I was sworn in on December 5th at 11 a.m. of 1994, December 5th. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, Orange County declared bankruptcy. Not our county, but Orange County. Now, the notion that the quintessential white upper middle class suburban community in California would go bankrupt was not realistic. And it shook everybody up in the municipal finance world. And lo and behold, we come to find out that the LA County, for different reasons, is about to go over the edge as well, because we were spending about 7.5% more than we were taking in. And because of a lot of hocus pocus, a budget, as I explain in the book, and most of you probably understand this, my students don't. A budget is not written in Mount Sinai. It's not etched in stone. A budget is just an estimate of what you think the revenues are going to be and what your expenditures are going to be. But you can assume you're going to get 10% more money than you're actually going to get and spend like it, and then you end up going bankrupt, or as the city of LA almost did during the Great Recession, and a number of municipalities did. We were spending more money. When I walked in, the previous board had spent more money than it was taking in. And we were on the verge of going over the fiscal cliff. It would have been a disaster. And it's a long story, and it's a whole chapter in the book. But we appealed to President Clinton, our congressional delegation. It was government at its best. We got partnerships going, and we were able to solve a potential fiscal calamity through working together. And even Republicans in the Congress were helpful to us, or at least they didn't get in our way, which is not something you can say today. So that was another one. The earthquake was another one. I remember one of the first disasters I had was there was a gasoline line that ran under Venice Boulevard, which I represented in the Palms area. And they were doing a widening of Venice Boulevard with the tractors and all this. And one of the tractors, whatever you call it, the thing with the long neck, my grandson would tell me what it is.
Tobacco?
Backhoe
thing?
And it punctured a hole in the gasoline pipe, and it erupted into flames. And it was spraying gasoline at a 45-degree angle over an entire block of homes, of businesses, with apartments on the top of them, and leveled the whole block. And there were some casualties, including one who happened to be driving along the way. Those are the kinds of things. So how do you deal with it, you ask? The first time something like that happens, it's you're learning by doing. The most important thing is to keep your head about you, right? Mm-hmm. There's a bunch of sayings about that. And I had it wasn't by design, it was just kind of by nature. When there was a crisis, my blood pressure went down. and I kind of went into while everybody else was uptight, and whether it's my staff or department heads or whatever, I try to keep my cool on it. And then I, when I go home, then I fly off the handle. But it's the nature of the business, and it's not just in politics. It's in every walk of life. I'm sure you have it on campus. I have it on campus. I had it just before I left the house. One of my students couldn't get the article online. He's going to be late in producing his assignment tomorrow. And it's not the Chatsworth Metrolink crisis, but it's that kid's crisis, and he's going to have a long night's sleep tonight. So everybody has these sudden changes in their life, and in politics, it probably happens more often than it happens in most because you're not only in a business of serving the people, you're also you're also on display for everybody who wants to be a critic of what you're doing. So you're making a decision, and the whole world will point out all of your flaws when you do it, so you're under different kind of pressure than most people are. But I thrived on it. I thrived on pressure, and you know, some people do and some people don't, and it's not a plus or a minus, it's just who I am.
So one of the things that we've all seen, I mean, I've lived in Southern California now for over three decades, and you talk a lot about it in the book. There's kind of a theme of the politics of development that go through many chapters, and there are a couple of specific chapters on development. And we've seen that there's a lot of money involved in development. And in fact, there just was the play-to-pay scandal in LA City Hall. Yeah. Jose Huizar just got sentenced, I think, to 13 years. A number of people have been sentenced. And we know there's a lot of money that's involved in politics. Clearly, you write about the fact that you always were able to vote against the people who were giving you campaign contributions, and you seem to kind of pride in that. Are there specific kinds of changes or structural reforms that you think we need in city councils and in particular on the Board of Supervisors to kind of help prevent these kind of scandals and the influence of money in politics? Look,
the problem with money in politics, you're not going to take money out of politics. There's some world leader who once said there's no guarantee that guarantees a guarantee. Okay, you can pass all the laws you want, somebody's going to find a way around it. So we put campaign contribution limitations at the city when I was at the city. Used to be able to raise money without any limits on what. If you wanted to write me a check to my campaign, not to me personally, to my campaign for $5,000, you could do that, or $50, you could do that. By the way, I didn't get too many $5,000 checks ever. But we put a cap on that, and I think it was $800 maximum. So what happened? So all the special interests, thanks to Citizens United, the case the Supreme Court decided a few years back, almost a decade now, they created these so-called independent expenditure committees. So if you're a developer and you want to put $3 million into a fund to elect 3 councilmen and 2 supervisors, you can do that. You call it Citizens for a Better Los Angeles. And you have to report it, and you can spend it on behalf of a candidate, but it's just a way to get around the campaign spending limitations for the candidate him or herself. So my point is that there's there's no way you can guarantee that you're not going to have corruption. The best way to stop corruption is, number one, have a vigorous local press, which is in retreat right now, as you know, and I'm not happy about it. I think we need a more vigorous press to keep an eye on what's going on in government. The only reason you know about that case is because it was reported in the papers. That's number one. Number two, the city has an ethics commission. It needs to be more vigorous. The county does not have an ethics commission. It has campaign spending limitations, but it doesn't have an ethics commission. And so you need to have oversight and accountability mechanisms so that when somebody does transgress, that they know there's a good possibility they're going to pay a price. Now, when you get the case that was in the paper the other day, where the guy got $1.5 million in cash, you know what $1.5 million in cash looks like? Take a dollar bill, because it's the same thickness as a $100 bill, and see how many $100 bills it takes to get to $1.5 million. I think it's 1,500 or 15,000. I'm not a Caltech student, so I can't. But it's a lot of bills. It's shocking, and the sentence he got, I think, will be a marker that every other elected official will have to look at when they're tempted to take any amount of money from anybody. Because to do 13 years, that guy's in his early 50s. He's not going to get out of prison until he's, I don't know what the parole thing is, but potentially until he's in his late 60s. The heart of his life is gone. Now, having said that, here's what I tell my public policy students when we talk about corruption. And it's really pretty elementary. I say, when you're offered a bribe and you take a bribe, there are two people who know about the bribe, you and the person who bribed you. Now, you may think that you can keep your mouth shut. What makes you so sure that other person isn't going to keep his mouth shut? Now, in the case of Weezar, his wife testified against him. I think one of his siblings testified against him. If you can't trust your siblings, then why are you going to trust some developer who slipped you an envelope? So if morality doesn't get your attention, then maybe self-interest does, because you can't go to sleep at night knowing for sure that someday that person who bribed you is going to talk to somebody. And you're going to get a reputation, even if it's not to the authorities. They're going to brag about how they gave you money. And then you get a reputation for being dirty. And that's a hell of a thing, to be in public office and have a reputation that you're for sale. Now, I'll tell you, this has been going on for 150 years in this town. I just reread a couple of chapters of the biography that was written on Fletcher Bowron, because I assigned it to my students. And Ernest Debs, who was a county supervisor in the seat that I served, once removed, that I served in. Ernest Debs used to be on the city council. He was a chairman of the planning committee, just like Mr. Weezar was. And he had a reputation for being for sale. And I chaired the planning committee for 2 years. Worst job I ever had. Begged to get off of it. Because you're under constant pressure, and not corruption pressure, just constant pressure of the work. And then you got people who want to wine and dine you and all this stuff. I had a philosophy that if I knew you were going to be coming before me as a councilman or as a county supervisor, my philosophy was that I would not take a campaign contribution from you, because it wasn't worth the $800 or $1,000 that my campaign would get to have to answer questions of the LA Times. Why did you take a contribution, and then vote for this guy? So, I'm amazed that the lobbying world, the third house, or whatever we called it in those days, and still call it, that they didn't understand that when I refused to take a contribution from them, that probably meant I was sympathetic to their view. If I was going to take a campaign contribution, it probably means I was going to vote against them. Now, I'll tell you the last thing. There was a quote in the LA Times when I became chairman of the planning committee, and there were, people were expecting, that I was going to be like my predecessor in the planning committee was, who was under investigation by the federal government. And there was a quote from an anonymous developer, or lobbyist. It wasn't a developer, a lobbyist for developers, who said, "Yaroslavsky takes our money with impunity, with the compliments of the donor, but then he votes against us. And that's a compliment to the son of a bitch." And I said, I want that on my tombstone. I had tremendous pressure from people. I write about it in the book on rent control. When we had a rent control crisis, a rent escalation crisis in 1978, right at the same time as property taxes were going sky high, and we had Prop 13. The other side of that coin was renters were getting skyrocketing rent increases. So there started to be a conversation about rent control, which ultimately happened, rent stabilization. 3 or 4 of my very few supporters that I had in my first campaign, who really didn't think I was going to win, nobody thought I was going to win, but they were riverboat gamblers. They were in their 30s. Developers are basically riverboat gamblers, and they took a shot on me. And when this talk about rent control came up, they asked me to have breakfast with them in the basement of the old Ollie Hammond's Steakhouse on La Cienega Boulevard. Some of you may remember. None of you have ever been in the basement of that old restaurant, which has since been torn down, but it looked like a mafia hangout. Dark wood, paneled, and it was breakfast, and there was no breakfast. They don't serve breakfast there, but they serve tomato juice and stuff. And the 3 or 4 of them did a full court press on me. We were there for you when you needed us. Now we need you. And they wanted me to vote against rent control. And this was a real test for me. This is 1977, 2 years, maybe less than 2 years after I'd been in office. And I remember saying to myself as they're talking, I said, I'm being tested here. And And I said, gentlemen, and they were all gentlemen, all males, and not necessarily gentlemen. And I said to them, I said, you know, when you supported me because I was kind of a free radical. I was an independent. I would stand up to the mayor. I would stand up to special interests. What makes you think that you can sit here and try to pressure me into doing something that would sell down the river all of those elderly people whose apartments I knocked on the doors of, who are now being threatened with eviction because they can't pay the rent? I said, you got the wrong guy. And those three of those four, I never spoke to again. They never spoke to me again, which was just fine with me. That's what you got to do. You've got to be able to say no. Jesse Unruh had this great line, which I won't quote in its entirety, but if you can't take their money, meaning for their campaign contributions, and a few other things, drink their booze, and then vote against them, then you're in the wrong business. You've got to be able to say no to your friends. And the last thing I'll say about this subject is I tell my students, the grad students in public policy, I said, when you go into the workplace, into your first job, the most important question you have to ask yourself, standing in front of a mirror, and this especially goes for elected officials, is what issue are you willing to lose your job over? What issue are you willing to risk your career over? Because if you can't answer that question, then you're going to be buffeted by every stakeholder and every special interest around. You got to know where to draw the line. And for me, I had a number of lines. One of them was standing up to people who thought they owned me. One of them was the Bill of Rights. Uncompromising on the First Amendment, especially separation of church and state and freedom of speech, even the speech that I don't agree with. And it's complicated. And I explained it to you as I explained it to my students. The Bill of Rights is the 10 amendments to the Constitution that protect the minority against the tyranny of the majority. That's what that's all about. What the Bill of Rights is all about. For a politician to uphold the Constitution, which is the oath we take, to uphold, to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, it's counterintuitive because we don't get elected by the minority, we get elected by the majority. So when the time comes to protect and defend the Constitution, that means, to me, the Bill of Rights. It's a difficult thing to do. I had an issue back when I was on the Board of Supervisors. We were sued or threatened with a lawsuit to remove the Christian cross from the county seal. That had been on there since the late 1950s. It was a slam dunk loser if we went to court, if we were sued. We were told by our attorneys, you will lose, and not only will you lose, but you'll get to pay your own legal fees and the legal fees for the ACLU who was going to sue us. That was a very tough decision for three of us who voted to take the cross off the county seal. Not because we were anti-Christian, but because the Supreme Court and federal courts up and down the country, across the country, had said you cannot put a religious symbol on a government seal because it implies an endorsement of that religion. It's just that simple. And there was no question about it. I've never heard an attorney, except for that case, who said, you will lose. They usually said, on the one hand, you might win. On the other hand, if you get a bad judge. This one was, it doesn't matter how many hands he has, you're going to lose the case. And I was the least, there were 5 supervisors. 2 of them supported keeping the cross on the seal, and 3 of them listened to the advice of the attorney. And by the way, I believed that it was the right thing to do, aside from the law. I was the only Jew. The other 2, Yvonne Burke was a Protestant. Gloria Molina just passed away about a year ago. Gloria Molina was Catholic. I didn't really take the brunt of the evangelical world out there and the right-wing shock jocks on the radio. They expected me to, as the perfidious Jew, to want to take the cross off the seal, but they thought that Yvonne and Gloria were traitors to their own kind, and they really took it. They were pummeled politically, Took a lot of guts, because you don't know where this is all going to land. Took a lot of guts for those two, and to some extent for me too. Let me put it this way. I was debating whether I should call the pension department of the county to see whether I should get my pension papers. I might get defeated at my next election. It turned out I overreacted. But you've got to have your red lines, and they got to be well thought out, and those are the two that stood out for me. And that's a long way from, what do we do about corruption? But the only thing, you have a role to play on corruption. You, the voters. You need to vote for, you need to pay attention to who's paying for the campaigns of the people who sending you all those mailers that you're getting in your mailbox right now. And see who's paying for it. It's very easy. Just look at the bottom. It says paid for by so-and-so, Committee to Save Los Angeles. They have to also say major funding by, and it'll tell you, the Apartment House Association of California, the police union, the, John Doe developer. You'll recognize a lot of the names. See who's paying for their campaigns. Most people will not turn their back on the people who fund their campaigns or even do it in an independent expenditure. You can be that backstop. Everybody has a role to play in that. But corruption is as old as the scriptures, and probably older than the scripture, and it's going to be around. The question is just minimizing it and hopefully eradicating it. Certainly we've had enough of it in the city of LA.
So you brought up the Board of Supervisors.
Yeah.
And students excluded, many of you, we talked about this earlier this week. How many people, well, you mentioned how many people are on the Board of Supervisors, LA County? 5. There's 5 members of the Board of Supervisors. And LA County, as we all know, we live here, is enormous, it's diverse, and yet 5 people run the county. You talk a little bit about reform, and you mentioned briefly that you think we should have an elected executive to run the county. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the rationale for that, but also, what other kinds of structural reforms do we need to make the LA County governance of LA County more accountable and more transparent? Because I suspect many people in the audience, myself included, have very little idea what the county does, but it spends what the current budget of the county is.
$40 billion.
Yeah.
So the county of Los Angeles, if it was its own state, would be the 12th largest state in the United States, which is about, I think North Carolina is number 11. Mm-hmm. When I became a supervisor, we were number 8. So other states have surpassed the county of LA. So on the first question, why we need an elected executive, an elected mayor, county mayor, is as I often say, if I went to North Carolina and I said, boy, do I have an idea for you. Get rid of your governor, get rid of your state legislature, both houses, elect 5 people, each representing 1/5 of the population of North Carolina, and let them run the place. I don't think I could get to the Appalachian Mountains fast enough before they put the cuffs on me and put me in an insane asylum. That's what we have. We have the 12th largest state in the union, governed by 5 people. There's no elected executive. There's a chief executive officer, but he or she, it's a she now, and she's terrific. But she's her job is she's at the mercy of 5 supervisors. On any given Tuesday when they meet, if 3 votes say you're fired, she's fired. So she's got to navigate those 5 people, and I'll tell you how it manifested, and why, an example of why we need an elected executive. During the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, Dr. Barbara Ferrer, she's not a medical doctor, but she's a PhD, and I have a really high regard for her. I never worked with her. She came in after I left office, but I've gotten to know her. And here comes the pandemic, and you had 5 supervisors. So imagine the chief executive of the county, the elected chief executive, is vested in 5 different people. Each of us had 1/5 of the power. She has to go and talk to each of the 5 supervisors and say, we got to have masks. Everybody's got to have a mask. We got to shut down the schools. We got to do this. We got to do that. Whatever Fauci and all of the experts were saying, and the spread that was taking place. And you had 5 supervisors, and they had 5 different points of view of what should be done. You had one supervisor who didn't believe in any of this stuff. I shouldn't say any of this stuff. That she was going too far. You had one person who, whatever the regulation is, go for it. My successor. By the way, that's where I would have been. No, you remember, we had thousands of people dying every day across the country. We had hundreds of people in the hallways at Cedars-Sinai and at the UCLA Medical Center, not to mention the smaller hospital. It was a disaster. People forget what was going on and what the anxiety levels were. So you had those 2 extremes, practically speaking, keep the restaurants open, keep this open, keep that open, and shut everything down. And then you had 3 other people in the spectrum, in the middle of that spectrum. Imagine yourself as the public health officer of the County of Los Angeles, the 12th largest county, the 12th largest state in the union, and you've got to negotiate with 5 people over what's a scientific policy. This is not a political decision. It is political, but the consequences are very medical and very existential. There's an old line that a doctor of mine once said when he was recommending I go on a certain kind of diet, and he wanted me to stop drinking coffee, and I said I could stop chocolate, I could stop hot and spicy foods, I can't stop drinking coffee. He said, you can negotiate with your doctor, you can't negotiate with your body. And you can negotiate with the supervisors, you can't negotiate with coronavirus. It has a mind of its own. Now, if you had one elected official who was accountable to all the people of the county, like the mayor of LA was, he had no responsibility over health care in this county, absolutely none. But he was the mayor of the second largest city in the country and the biggest city in the region. And when he calls a press conference at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they cover it live. When Barbara Ferrer calls a press conference at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, some of them cover it live. If a board of supervisors, first of all, the board of supervisors can't call a press conference because it's a violation of the Open Meetings Act. You can't have more than 2 supervisors. So, but if you did, you don't know who the supervisors are. Many of you do, but I bet you couldn't name all 5. Neither can some of the journalists in this town name all 5. And so they don't bother covering them. But we need a person who has a bully pulpit on issues like Martin Luther King Hospital when it shut down. Somebody who's accountable to all of us, not just 1/5 of us. When we had to shut down Martin Luther King Hospital because of our own incompetence and the incompetence of the health department, I could say, well, that's not my district. That was Supervisor Burke's district. I defer to them in their own district, which is really a cop-out. It was a big, and I say that. It's one of the things where I take ownership. That was a big failure on our part collectively and personally. It's one of the worst things that I've ever had to deal with. To shut down a hospital in one of the most medically underserved communities in the country. It was a tragedy, and it shouldn't have happened. But if you'd had one elected mayor for the county, that would have never happened. Why? Because that mayor would have been held accountable, and it would have been an existential threat to his or her political survival if that hospital closed on their watch. And that's what's missing. So that's why I'm a big fan. I'm a big advocate for having that's the single biggest reform. One of the reasons the county is opaque to most of you is that we don't have one person. It's not covered by the press. They have one reporter covering the county part-time. I don't know what it is now that they've laid off 20% of their reporters, but when I was on the county board of supervisors, we had 1 or 2 people covering the county, 12th largest state in the union, 2 people covering it. And they had 5 reporters covering City Hall. Now, where does that make sense? That's why it's opaque. Until I got to the board, they didn't televise the board meetings. My predecessor, God bless him, he's a great supervisor, but one thing he did not agree with me on, he did not want the supervisors' meetings televised. And I provided the 3rd vote when I came there. And all of a sudden, you could watch it on your cable TV if you were so inclined, and if you were nuts, you would watch us for 6 hours. But that's part of the reason. And the other reason I will tell you, and it's a frustration, and I've talked to reporters about it for many, many times. You care more about what your city does than what your county does, because most of you, I suspect, are not on welfare, you're not on public assistance, you have health insurance. You don't need the county. The county is the human service arm of society. The overwhelming percentage, 75% of the county budget is welfare, health care, child welfare, mental health, all of the human services. And they provide it for everybody, including Pasadena and the city of LA and every place else. That's of little interest to most of you, unless you have an intellectual or a professional interest in it. What you do care about is the potholes in front of your street, the crime in your neighborhood, homeless encampments, and stuff like that. You go to your city for that sort of thing. So there's more attention given to the city, to middle-class people. We used to have a bigger middle class than we do now. The city was a middle-class arm of government. The county is largely the arm of the low income, the poor, the marginalized in our society. Children who have been abandoned by their parents or have been taken into foster care or by the Department of Children and Family Services, another thing that's a shame for the county, et cetera. So it's opaque for a lot of reasons, and one of them is because people who read newspapers, when there was something called a newspaper, people who read newspapers were more interested in the municipal stuff and in the national and international stuff than they were in poverty in South LA or in the Northeast San Fernando Valley. It's just a reality. And this paper now, the LA Times, tries to put a bigger focus on the marginalized in our society, and their paper is getting thinner and thinner and thinner.
So on that depressing note, my time for questions is over.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, it was perfect answer. But Michael, I think we have some questions from our audience. Thank you.
We have a few, and if we can put up the slide with, there it is. If you focus on that, you can send us also a question. I've got quite a number here. And it just strikes me that we should be so lucky to have a 10-week course with Zev rather than a short evening, because there's really a lot to learn here tonight. You have a free Saturday night in Los Angeles. Which restaurant would you want to book a seat at? We'll throw you the easy one first.
Cantor's.
Cantor's.
That's where I take my grandkids.
What is your proudest moment while serving on the city council? That came from Anonymous.
There's a lot of them. It's like asking me which one of my grandchildren is my favorite. One of the things that I'm proudest of, the Olympic Games of 1984, that was a big deal. We took on the power structure in the city, the business community, the mayor, everybody who wanted the Olympics in the worst way, and were willing to sell the city taxpayers down the river. Remember in 1978, which is when we bid for the '84 games, that was 2 years after Montreal, we were which went into $500 million in debt over the Olympics. And there were a lot of problems with the Olympics. And I'm a big fan of the Olympics. I used to run track in high school. As I used to say, I'm the only member of the city council that subscribed to Track and Field News. But I wasn't willing to spend a nickel of taxpayer money on that event, as important of an event as it is. And without going into the details, a whole chapter on that. And it's an important chapter because it's the only history of the games that actually talks about this aspect of the games, the bid itself, and how this whole thing happened. We all remember the games as a great thing. It made money, $250 million in profits, and that didn't happen by accident. It happened because the city council, the majority of the city council, stood up to the power structure and forced them to do the right thing and not sign away not indemnify the International Olympic Committee for any cost overruns. That was one of my proudest ones. even more important than that was I came into the council when I was 26 years old. I was 3 years out of college, out of graduate school. I was a social activist when I was in college, and on a lot of fronts. And one of the things, I told you the Bill of Rights is one of my red lines. One of the things that I could not stomach was the LAPD's history of, and it was still going on when I got there, of using the law enforcement apparatus to spy on, monitor the political activities of people whose politics were different than the chief of police. This is a sordid history of the LAPD. It goes back to the 1930s, the Red Squads and this and that and the other thing. And I was on that list because I was an activist on behalf of the Jews, free emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union. Hardly a left-wing cause, and I wear it with pride because I was on a list of 200 people and organizations that included your pastor here at the Episcopal Church. I think it was Pastor Regas. I think it was him, but whoever the minister at this church here in Pasadena at that time was on the list. John Mack, the head of the Urban League, was on the list. Several of the members of the Tom Bradley's Police Commission were on the list. Tom Bradley was not on the list, but they had a file on Tom Bradley, offline. And I took them on. When I got to the City Hall, I took them on. And at a time when it was political suicide, and I was to take on the LAPD, and Chief Ed Davis, those of you who remember Ed Davis, I'd been to the Soviet Union 3 times before I got elected, and I played hide and seek with the KGB. After dealing with the KGB, the LAPD is a walk in the park, and I changed the culture of the city council at that time. The only people who were willing to take on the LAPD were 2 of the 3 black members. One of the black members was more like a Republican than the other 2. But the other 2 stood up. But there wasn't a white member of the city council, and you were either black or white. We had no Latinos in those days in '75. There wasn't anybody who among the whites who was willing to stand up and take them on, not just vote the right way, but to take them on and use their bully pulpit. And I did that, and I'm very proud of that. And over time, over the next several years, I was able to demonstrate to my colleagues that there's political life after taking on Ed Davis, or even more so Daryl Gates. I do believe in civil liberties very strongly, and it goes back to my youth when my dad explained to me, why my aunts in Ukraine sent me a telegram from my bar mitzvah, and it said, "Congratulations on your 13th birthday." And every other telegram we got said, "Congratulations on your bar mitzvah." And I tried to understand, why did they say congratulations on your birthday when everybody else said bar mitzvah? And he explained to me that if they had said bar mitzvah, 2 Hebrew words, that they could have been punished for it and arrested for it. It was a whole thing. When I tell the story in the book, the first time I went to the Soviet Union in 1968, I was a sophomore in college. My older aunt came from Kharkiv, which has been in the news during the Ukraine war, came from Kharkiv to Moscow to meet me, and she was kind of my tour guide. She took me around like a grandmother. And we're in the middle of Red Square. I asked her, what's it like? What's your life like here as a Jew in the Soviet Union? And she said, "Shh, the walls have ears." I'd never heard that phrase before. And I said, "What walls?" "We're in Red Square. It's 100 yards away. This is one of the biggest squares in the world." And that shook me up. And when I got back, that to this day, it's etched in my psyche that people's freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to politically associate is unassailable. It has to be unassailable. So that's one of and there are a lot of other things, but they're too in the weeds. I write about some of them in the book, but I had a good time. You know, I had a story that I tell. When I was sworn in the first time, Tom Bradley gives a little welcoming speech. He advised me to get a couple of new suits and get a haircut, which I thought was pretty good. And then he said, because now you're part of the establishment. And I ran as an anti-establishment candidate. And my response was, in my speech, was I may be part of the establishment, but the establishment is not part of me. And I'm most proud, this covers my whole career, that I never let the establishment become part of me. Until the very last thing that I did as a public official, which was to get the local coastal plan for the Santa Monica Mountains approved against overwhelming odds and powerful special interests. I got it done. That's what guided me. That and a quote from Lord Thomas Macaulay, a 19th century British philosopher, who said that no man is fit to govern great societies who hesitates about disobliging the few who have access to him for the sake of the many he will never see. And I was always about the many we never saw. Truman once said that, you know, there are 40 million people who are members of associations and federations. The other 140 million Americans are the responsibility of the President of the United States. I felt like I was the lobbyist for most of my people, the people who couldn't hire anybody, who didn't know how to spell Yaroslavsky, let alone know how to get to me. It was our job to get to them, and that's really the proudest accomplishment. I think I accomplished what I set out to do in that regard. You know, when I started, I'm not sure I knew that's what I set out to do. But in the rearview mirror, I'm very proud of those things. Sorry about the long answer.
Here's a question that's maybe going to be a little bit difficult. I don't know if you want to take it on or not. It says, Caltech students and postdocs are now voting on whether to join the UAW. We faculty have only limited ability to comment. If you can comment, please do so. I think you also at UCLA just dealt with an election of that sort.
I'm not going to comment. I will comment generically. I'm not going to take sides in this thing. We had our teaching assistants at UCLA are represented by the UAW. The university was offering a 6% increase over whatever period of time it was, and the UAW was demanding a 120% increase for the teaching assistants and research assistants. And the university ended up giving them 60%. As a result of that, this is just factual, you might infer a position on my part, but we were all warned that if we gave that kind of increase, that the way we were going to pay for it was we would have fewer teaching assistants. And I know this from my days in government. I'm a social progressive. I'm a fiscal conservative. I mean, conservative may be a wrong word. I'm a progressive who believes in paying his bills. And so you talked about Prop 13. When we had Prop 13, one of the things we had to do was freeze hiring immediately. And if we didn't freeze hiring, if we didn't freeze hiring, even in the police department, if we increased their pay, and we did to some degree, the way we were going to pay for it would not hire more police officers and leave the police officers' positions that were vacant, we'd leave them vacant. So there's no, and I get it from the teaching assistant's point of view and from the student's point of view, and I'm empathetic to them. But in the bigger picture, what's happened at UCLA, I believe, I know what's happened in my department, is they've had to cut their budgets in order to pay for the 60% pay raise, or for part of the 60% pay raise. Part of it's being covered by the university writ large, and part of it's being paid for by every department. So now you have professors who used to have teaching assistants to grade 60 papers a day, for the midterms and the finals. Now they have to do it themselves. Boy, is that a pain. And I never had a teaching assistant. I did it myself, and I'm doing it myself. But I don't have 60 students or 200 students in my class, in my lecture hall. I can handle it. So it's a zero-sum game. Maybe it's not zero-sum, but I don't know what the parameters are. But just be aware that if it gets too rich, then there's only going to be one way to pay for it, and that's to have fewer people. And I don't understand sometimes, the union should understand that, because at the end of the day, they have fewer members. Maybe I don't see it quite the way they see it. But I do believe that they deserve more than they were getting, for sure. But 60%, I don't know anybody else who's gotten a 60% pay raise in one shot, ever, not even close. So, but I'm sympathetic, I'm empathetic. Good luck. UAW did a good job for the teaching assistants at UCLA, and we'll see what happens. We'll all live through it.
This question comes back to what I mentioned earlier about my roots being in the arts, and I knew that Zev, during, I think it was high school days, was an oboe player, and I would joke with other friends that the most famous oboe player in Los Angeles was not known for his oboe playing.
That's for sure.
This question is, the Eagles were just in town with Steely Dan earlier this month. Which artists create the soundtrack of Zev's Los Angeles?
Well, if you're talking about rock and roll or pop bands and stuff, a lot of them. I mean, I love the Eagles. Don Henley was a constituent of mine. I know him. I haven't seen him in a long time, but I knew him quite well.
You write about him in your book? There's a little Don Henley.
There is?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. I forgot.
You have to read it.
He hasn't sued me yet, so it must have been nice. I love Neil Diamond. He was also a constituent of mine. I tell that story in the book.
You do, yeah.
About his complaint about somebody who wanted to build a tennis court.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
I didn't
Neil
think I said
Diamond,
it.
sorry to confuse the two.
Neil Diamond, it's a great story. I mean, there's a lot of great stories in this book. The sad part is how many didn't make it into the book. I may write another one just about the stories. But Neil Diamond was a constituent of mine in Holmby Hills, just east of UCLA and south of Sunset. Big estates, 2-acre estates. And his neighbor was going to build a tennis court right on the side yard of his neighbor's property. And when he found out about it, he was notified about it, and the neighbor needed a variance, a very small variance, encroaching about 6 inches or a foot into the side yard. Now, the side yard is like 100 feet. This is Holmby Hills. It's not the Fairfax neighborhood here. And it turns out that Neil Diamond composed did all of his work on composing music and writing lyrics in the breakfast nook, which happened to be on the side of the house that was going to be right next to or not right next to, but on the same side as the tennis court that his neighbor was going to build. So his lawyer calls me up. His lawyer knows me. He was a former city attorney, Bert Pines, and he tells me this is going on. And I said, I'd like to go over and see the house and see exactly what's going on, with the hope that maybe I'd get to meet Neil Diamond. This is one of them. And of course, would you like to meet Neil Diamond? I said, yeah, sure I would. And so I'll go over there at 8:30 and in the morning for a glass of orange juice, and he explained. In the meantime, I did all the research and the person who lived on the other side of this guy's property was Marge Everett, who owned Hollywood Park. And I happened to meet the guy who owned this house at a banquet for some charitable event. I didn't know him, but I knew who he was. And so I tell Neil Diamond, and I meet with him, that I have a plan. The plan is to have him build a tennis court on the other side. And he said, what happens if the neighbor on the other side doesn't want it on her side? And I said, well, Marge Everett doesn't write the songs for the American Songbook. You do, and I don't care about what she thinks. And I can't afford to have the next Neil Diamond hit not be written because we allowed a tennis court to go through. Anyway, I did reach the guy, and I told him, you can't build it there. Build it anywhere else, but don't build it next to his breakfast nook. And he didn't. Just a few weeks ago, finally, I took a look at through Google Earth to see what happened to this property, and where did he build the tennis court, And if he did, where did he build it? Well, he built it in the back. He had a lot of room in the back. And it stepped up. He's got a pool, then it stepped up, and he's got a tennis court. Doesn't bother anybody. It worked out. That's my Neil Diamond story. But my love for music is classical music. I did play the oboe in junior high school. You wouldn't want to hear me play it now. It sounds like a duck in heat. But I was raised on classical music at home. My parents, there are some people here old enough to remember the classical music station, KFAC, AM. That was what played in our house. I was more interested in Brahms and Beethoven than I was in rock and roll and Elvis and all that stuff. That's my passion. And so when I got to especially the Board of Supervisors, which aside from everything else is the cultural arm of the public sector in LA. We own the Hollywood Bowl, we own the Music Center, we own the County Museum, the Natural History Museum. We are a big operation when it comes to the arts and museum world. I had a lot to do with the redoing of the Hollywood Bowl, bringing it into the 21st century, the building of Disney Hall. I was one of many people who had a lot to do with it. But my passion for classical music is in opera, which is later in life I've got an appreciation for opera in a way that I didn't have when I was younger. That's what I really spend my time when I go to concerts. It's not to Taylor Swift. It's to the LA Philharmonic or the LA Opera and the many other musical institutions that we have here in Southern California.
My wife and I lucked out just by chance one night to be at the Hollywood Bowl when they gave you the opportunity to conduct the Star Spangled Banner with the LA Philharmonic.
Yeah, I did that twice, which is nice. The thing that they gave me the opportunity to do, Deborah Borda, who was the president of the LA Philharmonic before she went back to the New York Philharmonic, never forgive her for that. But Deborah invited me to narrate Lincoln's portrait, Aaron Copland's Lincoln's portrait, at the Hollywood Bowl on September 11th, 2012. And she knew it was something I wanted to do. I never asked her to, but I just told her, if you ever have a slot, and I told her that 10 years earlier, and then she gives me a call. And I did it, and I studied for it like I was studying for a Juilliard final. I wanted to do it just the way Copland had instructed, and to read the lines exactly where they were supposed to be. I do read music, so I was a little bit advantaged in that regard. And then I got a review in the LA Times from Mark Swed, God bless him, who, and the timing issue was the one that I was really focused on. I'd listen to it every day as I was going in and back to work and home, and just get it registered in my mind, muscle memory. And when I finished, I knew I'd aced it in terms of the timing of the words. And Mark Swed in his review said Yaroslavsky's timing was impeccable. And I said, all right. And so it was a great thrill. And I had a cameo appearance. We're just in a living room here, so I'll just. I get a cameo appearance. The opera gave me they honored me when I retired, and they offered me an opportunity to be an extra in the scene 2 of Act 2 of La Traviata, and with Placido Domingo on the stage. And I rehearsed with them, and then I performed. So I performed with them twice, once in rehearsal and once on stage. And it's the scene, those of you who know Traviata, it's a scene where they're in a gambling facility, a casino or something, somebody's living room with a roulette wheel or a blackjack, whatever it was. Anyway, so Mark Swed again does the review, and he said, in scene in the rear of the stage in Act 2 of the opera was a typical politician was Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky cavorting with women and gambling. And it was done with love. So I had a lot of great experiences with that, but I love the arts, and the great thing about the Board of Supervisors, we had a lot of crises. The best part about it was the role I played in contributing to improving, expanding the artistic footprint in Southern California. And most of it had nothing to do with me. Let me just tell you, I gave a speech back at UCLA early on in my supervisorial career. Think about what we've built in the way of cultural infrastructure in LA in the last, well, it was in a decade, about a decade or decade and a half. Disney Hall, the expansion of the County Natural History Museum, which is the city's, the county's oldest institutional building. It goes back to the early 1900s. The Getty Villas, the Getty Center. These aren't all county projects. Some of them are private. Most of them are private. The Broad Theater in Santa Monica, the Broad Museum in downtown, the Broad Contemporary Art Museum at LACMA, the rebuilding of LACMA, not even including what's going on there now. These were all done in the Performing Arts Center at Cal State Northridge. These were all done in a decade, most of them in a decade. If we had just done Disney Hall, or had just refurbished the Hollywood Bowl, or had just had the Getty Center built up in the Sepulveda Pass, we would have called it a great decade. We had it all. There has never been a city in the world that has had so much infrastructure, cultural infrastructure built in such a compressed period of time. And we've been the beneficiaries of that largesse. And the last thing I say about the arts, it's not just about the social implications it has. I mean, the arts bring people together. In a city, in a county as diverse as we are, to be able to come into a building and collectively enjoy music or dance, or even singing, even an opera, which it's important for the social cohesion of a community. It brings people from different walks of life and different stripes into the same space. But it's also hugely important for our economy. Cultural arts is a very big part of the LA economy. And I say more broadly, not just the Philharmonic or the classical stuff, but motion pictures and television and books. We sell more books here than in any other metropolitan area, and we did 15 years ago. I don't know what the stats are now, but we sold more books in LA than in any other metropolitan area in the country, including New York. More theaters in LA at the time I gave this talk than any other metropolitan area, including New York. This is a hotbed of cultural activity that also produces good jobs. It produces revenue for the city, and it doesn't leave a toxic residue. So I used to say this to people who were not necessarily opera fans or cultural fans. I say, here's why it's important that we build these facilities, because they are part of they're one of the legs of the stool of LA's economy.
To make sure that we get around to the selling of books, I'm going to just pose one last question that I think is particularly relevant coming from Caltech, and there were a lot of great questions, and apologies for not being able to get all of them. You may be able to sneak a question in when you're getting your book signed. What can academics focus on to be more helpful to policymakers? What are the best ways to bridge the gap between academics and practitioners?
Well, that's a complicated question. I think it's important, now having been in academia for nine years, I do think it's important to have a diversity of opinion on the campuses and not just one narrative. I'm troubled when I see only one side of an issue being presented, whether I agree with it or I don't agree with it. We had a panel discussion on a measure that was on the ballot a few years back, and they had a panel of 5 people. All 5 were against the measure. And I told the person in charge, I said, what would it have hurt to have at least one person, and by the way, I was against the measure too. What would it have hurt to have somebody on the panel who was for the measure, perhaps the author of the measure, and let the chips fall where they may. When you're only spoon-feeding people one side of the argument, you're not doing them any good. You're not giving them any critical thinking capabilities, as was the case when I was a student. We see it all the time. We see it on foreign policy issues. We see it on domestic policy issues. And there's no tolerance for other points of view. That's a problem. It's a problem everywhere in society now, and I think part of it is social media, and part of it is polarization. It's all of the above. I'm worried about academia. I think about my grandkids, and where would I want them to go to college, and what would they learn in college? If they came to Caltech, they'd learn how to put a man on the moon. If they go to a liberal arts college, what will they learn? I say it's a rhetorical question. Of course, they're going to learn a lot of stuff, but the ability to critically think is, I think, the most important thing, especially given what's happening to our democracy right now. People need to be able to distinguish between fact and fiction. That's in short supply. So what could academics, as a public official, academics could have and did provide me with a lot of information that helped me shape policy. I have a feeling now that if I was in office, the first thing I'd ask when I got a report from an academic is, are the statistics stacked? Was the answers to the problem preordained, and then you just fed in the, and I see that. I'm not going to point a finger at any particular institution, but I see that all the time. And life is not so simple as saying, the way we solve the housing problem is through supply and demand. If that was so easy, it would have been done by now. It's not just about supply and demand. It's about externalities. It's not just about housing, it's about affordable housing. I talk about that in the book a lot, in that one chapter. We don't have a housing shortage in California. We have an affordable housing shortage in California. And what's being built now are market rate housing units, which are going to satiate the demand of people who are making $100,000 to $150,000 a year or more. But it's not going to deal with the 40% of the people in LA County who live in households that earn less than $60,000 a year, or the 18% of the households in LA County that earn less than $30,000 a year. Not one apartment building that's being built in LA at market rate is going to be for those people. And they're the ones that are being squeezed, not the people making $100,000 or $150,000 a year. So, and what you hear is, well, supply and demand. We all know what supply and demand is. I was an econ major as well as a history major. I remember my first econ class, and I'll conclude with this. The professors drew a supply and demand curve, and he said, this represents perfect competition. Price of widgets go up, the demand will go down. The price goes down, the demand will go up. That's called perfect competition, he said. But I'm going to add one more thing, he says to the class. There is no such thing as perfect competition. And that's a fact. And yet you get spoon-fed all of these legislators who don't have the time to contemplate their navel, who are not looking at legislation critically, and they be, it's supply and demand. Yeah, obviously, if you build a lot more housing units, the price will come down. Anybody here seen a price go down in a rental unit, despite all the new apartments that have gone up? Not one. Okay, so why is that? Because there's externalities that come into play here. And that's what bothers me about academics, about academia, is they spoon-feed you this one narrative, and then people follow that narrative blindly, and then they wake up 10 years later, and all of a sudden there are 20-story buildings being built behind somebody's single-family home, and they're all market rate housing. Maybe the 10% of them are going to be for middle-income housing, and it hasn't done a darn thing to increase affordability. And by the way, once they build enough housing units at market rate for the people who are making a lot of money, they're going to stop building. They're not going to build until they satiate the demand of people who are making $30,000 a year household income, or $45,000 a year household income. So it's a sham, it's a scam. And I give credit to the Wall Street and the hedge funds who have done this deal in the legislature that carried their water. And you want to know about corruption? I say with a lowercase c. I'm not saying anybody has taken a bribe, but the campaign contributions that have flowed to state legislators who have carried some of that state legislation is humongous. Makes the city hall in LA look like peanuts. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars going into campaign funds because they've made it possible for people to make a lot of money by rezoning. There's no more single-family zone in California, and so you can build a 4 or 6 unit apartment building. Actually, on my property, my house, which is a standard lot, I could subdivide it. I could build a duplex on one lot and a duplex on the subdivided lot. So what is now a single-family neighborhood could have quadruplexes on every parcel. Not the worst thing in the world. Quadruplexes are not the worst thing in the world, but a 20-story high-rise would be the worst thing in the world. And that's what's happening in LA. And I know you're having the issue here in Pasadena. This has been an issue. And you've got a lot of resources, a lot of historical resources here to protect. And yet the legislature has moved with one fell swoop. I'm off on a tangent here. The main thing I want to say is that our students today need to be taught to critically think. I was taught that in my 10th grade English class by one of my great teachers, George Schoenman. It wasn't just about English and writing compositions. It was about looking at commercials on television and saying, what does it mean, Winston tastes good like a cigarette should? What should a cigarette taste like? Why does it taste good? Anybody ever taste a cigarette? He'd ask the class. Well, I could say I tried one when I was 7 years old and I threw up. So it doesn't taste good like a cigarette should. So I learned how to look at advertising, both political and non-political advertising, and say, what does it really mean? And if it doesn't mean anything, then there's something fishy. So that's the best thing that a university can do for a student, is to teach them how to critically think and give them all sides of the issue, and then let them navigate the future. Anyway, listen, I want to thank you, Mike. Thank you so much for inviting me to come to Caltech. I told you before, I had 2 stepbrothers who graduated here long time ago, and but this is the first time I've ever taken a walk through the campus. Even though I used to teach at the synagogue here when I was a college student up on Altadena Drive, I always drove by this place and I always looked at it with reverence. I'm a big fan of Lucy Jones, the seismologist, psychologist, as I call her. And I did go to her lab once, so that's another time. But this is a great university, and one that is not sufficiently appreciated in the Southern California region. Talk about economic engines. Caltech and JPL and the whole scientific community here is really important to us. So it's an honor for me to be here, and thank you for coming out on a Tuesday night.
Thank you. Thanks, Zev. Thank you so much.
I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to remind you, you can get on the Caltech events mailing list by going to events.caltech.edu. Special thanks to Mike Alvarez for bringing up the idea of inviting Zev. Zev Yaroslavsky, thank you again. We're going to take about 2 minutes to get his microphone off of him, and he'll be out at the back of the hall, just outside, to sell books.